Firstly, thank you for attending this Fieldwork Investigations in Geography webinar by the Geography Department at King's College London. I suppose a quick introduction to myself. My name is Kevin Lougheed. I am a historical geographer here at the department, and I examine the origins and introduction and spread of state-regulated education across the British Empire in the 19th century. I'm also a lecturer of geography education in the department, so that means I'm involved in the teaching and pedagogic functions throughout my time here. So I suppose the idea, for a bit of background, the idea of this webinar came off our interactions with various teachers throughout my time. I'm the outreach tutor as well for the department. So in my interaction with teachers, A-level teachers, we found the introduction of the independent fieldwork investigation for the A-levels introduced and posed several challenges, both to the teachers that we're interacting with, like yourselves, and the students involved in conducting these independent projects. So when I started looking at the NEA, it quickly realized that in effect, it was a dissertation in itself. So us lecturers supervise several dissertations a year. I think I have about 15 at undergrad and master's level. So we thought it might be useful to at least start sharing that experience with teachers who are going through the same experiences as we have done as well. So I suppose to start off with, the central theme for what the afternoon is about today is this idea of what actually constitutes fieldwork, what constitutes independent investigations and fieldwork. So what are some of the best practices you as teachers can use to facilitate your students within this? So just to give a background again, at King's, we have a diverse student base, quite a diverse student base, with multiple fieldwork and independent investigations throughout a geography degree, from local London-based to domestic to international field trips, to various independent projects, as well as dissertations themselves. So throughout the afternoon, we will have different examples of how we at King's deal with this focus of what constitutes fieldwork and independent projects, and how we assist and guide students through this process ourselves. One of the first and most important challenges faced when conducting or supervising fieldwork investigations and independent investigations is that of the research question, both in terms of how the actual research question is formed, but also how practical that research question is. Well, often in my first meeting or my first discussion with a student who has to do a project, my first question is, what actually is a research question? So in my experience, students often stop at identifying what the research problem is, or they come up with a vague idea of what they are interested in, what they want to talk about, and settle on this as an actual question. So this is usually the general area that they want to examine within a given geographical topic. But the problem is, and as you'll probably have experienced yourself, this is often very broad and vague. It's often actually hard for a student to grasp doing work with that question. So a good technique that I often use, and I know several of my colleagues use, is to ask a student to summarize their research idea or their research project in one sentence. And what you'll find is if they can't do that, if it needs to take 4 or 5 sentences to explain their research project, the result is often because their research question is too broad and they can't get a grasp of it. The issue with this is a vague research question often leads to further problems down the line with research design. Without a specific enough research question, it becomes quite unclear how to approach answering that question, or what type of data, or how you collect data to answer that question. So an important thing to think about when discussing research questions with students is that you should already be able to get an idea of what the methods or approach might be to that question within the question itself. I'll go through some examples of this. So how do I do this with my students? Well, I often sit down with my students and get them to break down their research idea using this type of framework that hopefully you can see on screen. So hopefully what you can see on screen is it doesn't start with the research question itself. That's not the first element. What I get is get students to work down to their research question by narrowing down their idea through the idea of what I call a topic, and then a research problem to the question they are addressing. So what is their overall topic they're interested in studying? Well, what are the problems that they're interested in studying within that they can examine? And then what is the specific question itself? So that might be, what is the overall topic I'm interested in studying is climate change. What is the problem of the topic I'm interested in examining? Well, adaptive or mitigation policies for climate change in my region. Students often stop with that, say, well, that's not quite narrow enough. So it might be a specific question within that, might be what is evaluating the success of one mitigation topic. However, what you might see from this as well is I get my students to break this down even further into sub-questions, breaking that research question into sub-questions. This not only gets them to think more about the question, but it often is it's these sub-questions which link directly into the methods that the students end up using. And I'll show examples of this in a second. And then I often get my students to go beyond this and ask them what to think about what's the significance of those questions. What impact will the answer to that research question have on the problem? And usually in addressing this, it gets them to think about what actually will frame their conclusion. If they find out their answer, what does their answer actually signify? And that's usually involved in the conclusion of a project. So to give a few examples of this, and the examples I'll be using in my session at the start are all real examples of ones I've gotten my students to use in the past, current or previous dissertations or fieldwork investigation examples. So to use one example from a recent student, this is how they broke down their framework. So they're interested in plastic waste in the environment. That's their interest topic. But they address the problem of, is there too much plastic waste going to a landfill and beyond? You can probably start to sense that in your experience, that's often where students finish and go, okay, well, that's my question. That's my research question. You can start to see some of the problems with this. Because one is too vague. What is meant by too much plastic? What does too much plastic waste mean? What counts as too much? How would you even evaluate what this means? How do you evaluate too much? What methods could you possibly use? It's still not quite specific enough. But that's where students start to kind of say, okay, that's my research question. And what you might start to experience as students or have experienced, and this is where I experience, is this is where some student anxiety comes into play. As they're not quite clear on both what they're exactly addressing or how they can actually go about this. And that often results from their research question not being specific enough or not going down that extra level in specificity. So what is needed is to break that question down into further sub-questions, looking at certain topics. So in this case, the research question is actually more specific. How are my local supermarkets reducing their plastic waste? You can start to see that's an achievable research question. And inherent in that, you can start to think about different methods that might link to. But that all then links to where I get my students to break them down into further sub-questions. And these sub-questions often identify the methods that are meant to be used. So is there any evidence of local supermarkets reducing their plastic waste? Well, that's a sub-question that addresses that wider question. But it also links to that, actually, how do you go about answering that? Well, that would be some sort of quantitative. Can you figure out data before and after certain plastic policies were in place? Having a look at policies in place to reduce plastic. Or a sub-question might be, what are the managers doing to reduce their plastic waste? Or what are their perceptions, which might clearly lead into interviewing the managers themselves. Or another interesting question might be, are the customers concerned or even engaged with reducing their plastic waste? And that might lead to something like questionnaires. So we can start to see from where students usually stop, which is there too much plastic waste going to landfill? Get them to think deeper about those more specific research questions and breaking that into sub-questions suddenly starts linking into more clearer understanding of what they're doing and how they might do it. And then moving on, a significance could be from answering that question, encouraging future supermarket policy, which would be a nice conclusion remark of an independent investigation. Now, to bring up a more physical science example of a dissertation that was done quite recently, a very good dissertation. Someone was interested in air pollution in an urban setting. And the problem they had looked at was can technology reduce the effects of air pollution in the city? Again, the student stops there. It's very broad and very hard to grasp what method you do to answer that. So they did a very specific research question. How effective was a specific technology, an IV screen, installed at a local school at reducing air pollution in the playground? You start to see already inherent in that, you can see the sub-questions linked into the method. What are the pollution levels outside and inside where the screen is? Well, that goes into looking at air quality monitoring. If you go onto the physical stream later on, Professor Mark Mulligan will be looking at air monitoring and how the King's Department does this. Another sub-question, how does this bring pollution down to legal limits? Starts to bring in questions about what are the policies and how effective are these technologies at in reducing pollution in regards to those policies. And then you can have multiple questions on what are the different potential health impacts, or what do parents view with this, etc., etc. So you can start breaking that down to several sub-questions, which automatically link into different methods. So that's just an idea of, well, how I, anyway, and how certain people and my colleagues start thinking about research questions with students, and breaking that down to make sure they start understanding and getting a practical research question. However, this leads us to one of the biggest challenges, is actually helping a student to find these topics and questions. So they might understand what a research question is, but how do you actually help students find these topics and questions? So my biggest piece of advice, and you'll hear me say this numerous times throughout this session, is that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. This often leads to kind of head scratching and some stress from students trying to find some world-breaking, world-renowned research that's completely new. It's not necessary, and it often leads to stress. And I have students come in going, I want to set the world alight with my research. Say, well, we don't all have the opportunity to do that. No need to reinvent the wheel with this. So often I say students should simply start off with what their interest in geography is. That often outlines the topic of study in that framework I was discussing earlier. Whether this be something like climate change or urbanization, coastal erosion, whatever their interest is. But once they have that, it's about narrowing down those interests to getting to a specific topic in question. And there are several different ways to do this, and several different ways I get students to think about it. One way is to look at previous examples of projects. For your school, for example, do you have a list of previous independent investigations that students can use as a launching pad? One, to understand what research questions have been done in the past, but also get them thinking about the topics they're interested in. That's often what we do in our cases, is we get students to look at previous examples of dissertations, starting to get them thinking about, again, how a research question is posed, but also as a launch pad of thinking about their topics of interest. Connections to other subjects. So in A levels, knowing that students do 2, 3, 4 A-level subjects. Of course, geography cross boundaries of subjects. So is there a connection between their geography idea and whatever other A-level subjects they are doing? Is there an overlap in their interests? That can often lead to a very fruitful way of coming up with interesting questions. In regards to schools as well, it probably, and often could be the case, that this opens up some resources for the students from other areas of the school with their other A-level subjects. What are the key thinkers or researchers in their idea or topic? What are the most recent news articles? So a lot of the assignments we do with first years in our tutorials is get them to look at news articles, because that's another launch pad of, okay, there's interesting stuff that's happening, there's interesting research going on, but it also brings up questions. Another important element is, are any of those researchers in the interesting topic in universities nearby? Can they get in contact? Can they start posing questions to that? So who are the key researchers in that region, in that area? It's often a fruitful way of helping students find questions. Here's one I will be talking about in detail in a minute: examining existing projects and data. Again, this idea of not reinventing the wheel. Often playing with data and existing data sets is one of the best ways of finding research questions. I will go through an example of this myself. Is there an existing project that does something elsewhere that can be applied to your local area, for example? Or is there a data set of something I'm interested in? If I start playing with that, what questions can start coming up with that? So playing around with existing projects and existing data can often be a way of narrowing from a topic of interest to a specific question. One I'll talk about in detail in a minute is retrospectively from method. So one method I have, or one technique I have, is if a student is struggling to come up with a research question, well, you can work back to a research question from method. What methods are the students able to do or interested in doing? What type of information does that give? What type of question could you answer from that? So thinking out loud, if a student is interested in climate change and they were really interested in using focus groups, for example, well, focus groups gives you interesting perspectives from different groups and different categories of people, and how those categories of people interact in those ideas. So if a student has an interest in climate change and has an interest in doing focus group, you can start using those to think about what questions can come up. For example, what are the interactions between different generational ideas in regards to climate change in a certain area? Suddenly you've gone from focus groups back to a question. So that's one way to retrospectively come to a question from the methods themselves. Of course, if all else fails, there's a good old standard geographical formula for questions. What role does insert concept or process play in some geographical issue in a certain location? I will go through certain examples of this, but you can really categorize a lot of geography problems and questions into these questions. Evaluating a geographical factor and how it impacts a certain issue in a given location. Or to what extent does a certain factor or concept explain a certain geographical issue in a certain location. So looking at those geographical formula, I had a quick look at past and present dissertations and seeing that formula does quite apply to a lot of students. One dissertation that was just submitted last week, for example, with myself, looks at what role does the concept of authenticity and authentic urban landscapes play in gentrification in Camden. Perfectly valid question. Student did a very good dissertation on that topic. Or evaluating how potential climate change impacts erosion rates in the River Conway Basin. Or to what extent does Blue Planet 2's documentary impact explain the changing attitudes towards plastics in London? And these are all examples of previous dissertations that have been done in our department. So once a student has found their question and starts to figure out how to put this into practice is the next step. So that means moving on to methods. How do we put that research question into practice? So how do you help a student establish the appropriate method? Well, as already mentioned, this is quite hard to do with a broad research question. So if a student is finding quite hard or quite difficult to come up with what method they should implement, often the first case is to go back to the research question and to keep narrowing down the focus until that starts leading into, okay, well, that's clearly how I go about doing that. But there's also other ways to approach this, like I just mentioned, and this helps if a student is struggling to come up with a question, can go backwards from that. What are the limitations for the students? What they can and can't do can often eliminate methods until there's only certain options left. Are there any spatial or locational limitations to what methods they can implement? Are there any technical limitations? Are there any skills or knowledge-based limitations? Does a student have access, or maybe a student doesn't have access to talk to certain groups of people? Well, in that case, well, you can't do interviews, for example. So once you have a question, you can start looking at methods. If there's multiple methods, start using the process of elimination as usually the first case of what I can and can't do before you actually choose what you can do. But I suppose the most important element in determining what methods should be used is the type of data needed. So realistically, in a nutshell, methods is the type of data needed determines the method that should be used. For example, to use an example a minute ago, if you're doing work on perceptions of climate change, for example, you need opinions and knowledges and interactions from certain people. That leaves certain methods you can use. So to use a bad example, I had a case recently where a student was examining something to do with identity and how different people and how a certain group identifies and what influences that identity. But identity itself is a subjective term, it's a subjective idea. What influences my identity is different to someone else's. It can differ across people. So you need to use methods that tease those elements out of what factors influence different people in what way, such as interviews or focus groups, or maybe even some ethnographic methods and observations. However, the student chose to do a questionnaire with closed questions on a scale of 1 to 10. How do you do this or that? And the data produced from that is just unable to answer that question. So thinking about the data you need to be able to answer a question is the most important thing to think about with methods. So the type of data is clearly central. So what is important then for us is what constitutes data, what constitutes primary data and secondary data, what constitutes primary analysis of data itself, and as mentioned in some of the framework, what constitutes independence itself. So this is what the geography department states for master's dissertations, for example, and fieldwork investigations, in terms of independent work and originality. So what you can see here is that it does not focus on something absolutely new or something that has a large amount of new data that needs to be collected, but that you're able to show independent learning or a new perspective on a geographical phenomenon. So you can see it's about the traditional idea of posing new questions and collecting new data. That's the kind of more traditional view of dissertation science. But it's also reanalyzing old data in new ways or for a new purpose, offering new interpretations on existing ideas or work. So it's about that independent learning as opposed to necessarily new types of data collection. However, if we start combining that kind of viewpoint with looking at the guidelines for independence in the field investigations, and I keep using the AQA specifications for this, so apologies if you use another version, but it's given the same idea. You can start seeing that the general idea about independence in the guidelines is about developing the research process, defining a question, drawing on research, contextualizing, summarizing, and presenting that data. Still quite vague, I might say. But what you can start to see is this idea draws on research, including field data and secondary data, which must be sourced by the student. So I think this is where it is really important to kind of frame and keep things in mind, coming to this theme of not reinventing the wheel. And you can work from secondary data and use field work and primary collected data to supplement this and combine with it. I think this is where the key to really kind of getting to good projects, contextualized projects, and getting students attuned to the process really quickly. So that leads on to this idea of thinking about what constitutes primary sources of data and methods themselves. What is primary data? So often we get a student to think about this idea of what you need to do an independent project, you need to go do some field work. And you definitely have experienced straight away the idea of questionnaires, interviews, and statistical analysis come to mind. Again, absolutely fine. However, sometimes these are not necessarily the most appropriate, and sometimes can actually be the most difficult in terms of some of the limitations. They can be quite time intensive, some of the skills needed are quite specific, and so on. So there's a whole raft of other methods that can be utilized for independent projects, what I often encourage my students to do. And these can be from technical forms such as simple GIS measures, and in both the looking at archival material in the human geography thread and the approach to qualitative or quantitative research in the physical geography thread, you'll see examples of this that students can use for A-level independent investigations. But there's some more technical ones, but there's also more interpretive ones, such as visual methodologies, breaking down and understanding and deconstructing the world around us and understanding social relations. A lot of my students work with observations as a method in their various forms. This can be observing people's behavior through ethnographic style research, looking at how people behave in their everyday lives in certain geographical contexts. This can also be done online, looking at social media behavior and social and virtual ethnography. But it can also be observing and deconstructing the various landscapes to understand the world around us geographically, what I often call reading the landscape, which is what I do in my own research and what I get students to do. And I'll show an example of this with one project I had students doing quite recently in a few minutes. But there's also many other forms of data and analysis which can be considered primary and original, such as new analysis on existing databases, can highlight new knowledge. It's new work done, it's just that the data exists already. Spatial analysis done, new spatial analysis done on existing databases that has not previously been done. I'll show an example of this. Archival analysis of historical documents. Well, historical documents exist, they're already produced, it's not primary collected data, but you're collecting data from that and analyzing that. And I spend most of my time as well, the next human geography session on archives, discuss how that can be done and how that can be a fruitful way of coming up with ideas and questions and projects themselves. And these are just some examples which can help either do a project itself or can supplement other data collection methods. So what is quite important then to think about, and what I'm trying to probably get to the core of, is what is important is getting the idea of the ability to combine primary and secondary data sources. So this slide is just to highlight the RGS go through this extensively in their guide to the fieldwork investigation, you can see that most researchers, including myself, will combine both primary and secondary data collection in their projects. So there's some really useful guides on how to do this and how a student can break this down in some of the RGS documents on their guides. So thinking about this idea of combining primary and secondary data sources for a project is a useful way of conducting research. As I mentioned, it can help come up with the research itself, but it can also help circumvent some of the limitations a student might have in collecting data. They can't do a certain element of data. Well, maybe that data already exists and they can use that to supplement their work. So again, the theme of not reinventing the wheel is central to this. We can use the constraints of the independent investigation to focus that question for the student. Possibly base the project itself around existing secondary data that already exists, either a data set or an existing project, and start to supplement this with their own field collected data, which can be done in many ways. So thinking about coming up with projects, starting off as a launchpad of existing work, can supplement this with their own field data in many ways, such as applying what's there to a case study of their local area, can collect local data as a case study to supplement that wider existing data and see how that combines, collect data from different areas or compare their local area to different areas. There's definitely spatial elements to this, so spatial mapping can come into that, supplementing already existing work. Confirmation of existing data or existing arguments. What is the existing argument in a certain project? How does that apply to my local area? Does it actually work? Exactly, can you apply that concept elsewhere, or does your local case compare to that different? So you can use existing data as a launch pad and supplement that with field collection. So just to do 2 quick examples of finding projects through either existing data or limitations. Here was an example I used after playing around for about 10 minutes with existing data set. I went on to the data.gov.uk website, which has a lot of existing databases. I'm currently sitting here in Dublin, so I look for Irish cases. Searched by Belfast is an area I get a lot of students to do work in. Just 2 databases existing in Belfast, one looking at air quality, and then this random one looking at Belfast street trees. And that just seemed a little random that it caught my attention. So I was like, okay, what does Belfast street trees actually compromise? So that linked me to the data page for Belfast. We start to see there's information on sports pitches and playgrounds, which could be a really interesting project in itself. But I was like, oh no, I'm now hooked to understand and see what is meant by Belfast tree data. So I downloaded the data set and started playing around with it. And started seeing that is actually in Belfast, they have a large database of their trees in the city itself, such as the species type or its age, or what I suddenly became interested in is they monitor the conditions of the trees themselves. So as a geographer, I was like, well, this has some really interesting potential questions that come up from this. So using those formula from earlier, I just came up with 3 questions off the bat. What role does street flora, such as trees, play in the experience of place using that concept in Belfast? Or evaluating how green gentrification policy, how does urban redevelopment and greening space play impact the conditions of trees in Belfast? Or to do a more physical one, to what extent does declining street trees explain increased flooding in Belfast? There's some potential questions just coming from playing around with an existing data set. So having a look at actually putting that into practice then, have a research question, what role does street flora play in the experience of place in Belfast? Well, what ways can you do that in a project? Well, you could do some analysis on the existing data. There's some spatial analysis, statistical analysis. Lime trees and maple trees are the most heavily used street tree in Belfast, which is interesting in itself. Did some spatial analysis and mapping. Quickly found out that the fair and good quality trees are congregated around the important architectural and cultural heritage places in Belfast. And as you move away from them, the tree quality and condition gets poorer and poorer. So clearly trees are adding to this idea of cultural heritage in Belfast, simply just looking at some of the mapping techniques. But then you can supplement that with some actual in-field information and do some field collection. This can be done in many ways. It can be done from looking at observations and photographic evidence. And you can see in the RGS guide, it talks about field sketches and photographs. Looking at more detail about the landscape can be added to this. Or archival research and having some knowledge based on kind of regulation and legislation of trees in Irish historical past. I know that there's probably a very specific reason that you could trace back through the archives of why lime and maple are the most important or heavily used trees in Belfast City. Or you go to more traditional ones. You can interview a council worker, understanding how they maintain trees to add to this, or interview residents of an area, looking at, for an example, a quote I made up, looking at how trees might be important. And you start to understand that more and more supplements to that already existing data can come through. Or you can go through more non-traditional methods, a sensory diary of a student walking through Belfast City, taking a diary accounting their senses and how trees play in that sensory geographies of the city. Again, that was just one project coming up from playing with the data. Well, how about projects through limitation? So our second year field trip last year, I brought students to Lisbon. But we only have 3 days in which they can do a research project in Lisbon. So they have to come up with a project based on certain limitations of what they can and can't do. Those limitations might be time. They have only 3 days in which to do the research. Language, well, they don't speak Portuguese. Or resources, they don't have a huge amount of resources other than themselves and pens and paper. So what my students figured out very quickly is that street art is a very prominent element in the urban landscape of Lisbon. Street art being graffiti, and different forms of painting and mural and street art. So they came up with this question: what is the role of street art? What role does street art play in the urban landscape of Lisbon? Again, perfectly valid question. Very practical, but based on the limitations of what they have. Broke down to sub-questions: how does street art express the spatial identity of those marginalized communities of the city? So the more you look into street art, you realize that it's actually an expression of resistance in the concept of rights to the city. Who has and hasn't the rights to the city? Those who feel marginalized often express that marginalization, critique, and identity through street art. So how does this actually express itself? But in Lisbon, it's very interesting because that is an expression against rights to the city and being marginalized, but is now being co-opted and commercialized by those people who are dictating the rights to the city in the city itself. So how is this process actually happening? And is there a spatial aspect to this in terms of mapping? So thinking about projects through limitations, the questions, the potential methods they have in 3 days, start thinking about observations and visual methodologies, deconstructing that street art, looking at, for example, this clear one, which is in an area of redevelopment, commercial redevelopment, which is clearly a critique of globalization, neoliberalism, and kind of American corporation and corporatism coming into Lisbon. So deconstructing those expressions and how they are expressed around the city. Other methods they did use were things like photo essays or photographic cartography, looking at how these expressions change spatially through the city through photographic evidence and photographic cartography. And again, thinking about those ideas of reflective field diaries or emotive diaries. Again, can supplement this type of work with traditional forms. Interviews with street artists and tour guides looking at the role of street art in this kind of co-opting street art into the commercialization of Lisbon in terms of tourism, looking at participation observations, so looking at tourists and how they interact, possibly talking to tourists, or looking at museums and art galleries that introduce some of this urban art and doing observations and analysis of that. So looking from limitations of having 3 days with no language, Portuguese language, and little resources, you start working backwards to coming up with projects. So thanks for watching that video. Please do subscribe to KCL Geography YouTube site. And for any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact the department.